Amen. Well, tonight it kind of seems almost anticlimactic, but we're going on into 2 Samuel chapter 1. And so this is the beginning, part 1 of 2 Samuel, and we're going to be looking at the first 27 verses of 1 Samuel. And I've called this a sorrowful song scripted at Ziklag. And that really takes place in the last several verses here, but it's all the backdrop. It's all the background that takes place for the composing of this song and the composer of this song. We're going to continue, like I said, in our study. And just again, remember, it really does really kind of, and that I'm not getting into the overall outline or anything else because I don't want to break it apart and get the distance too far away from our last chapter in the 1 Samuel, which was really a very dark book, the way that it ended with Saul's death and everything that took place. And so this really starts off reminding us about death and destruction. And it really is, again, about how this story about how this sorrowful song was written and the contents of it, and that it was really a very deep emotional and very personal feelings that gave expression to Israel to sing this song. But as you'll see, it was not a song to be sung where others could hear it. It was a private song for just Israel. My chapter outline, if we're going to look at that, is back at Ziklag, and that's just verse 1. Then a survivor from Saul, that's verses 2 through 5. The lying scavenger, verses 6 through 10. Sincere sorrow, verses 11 and 12. Headed for trouble, verses 13 and 14. A sentence of death in verses 15 and 16. Continuing sorrow in verses 17 and 18. And then the song of sorrow, which takes place from verse 19 to the end of the chapter, or verse 27. All of those will give you a heading when we get to those portions of scriptures. So I'm just going to deal with verse 1 first of all, back at Ziklag. And that's basically it. And that came to pass after the death of Saul, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, and David had abode 2 days in Ziklag. So you can kind of get the sense what you're seeing is that we're on a parallel track. The stories are being told, and they're being told one right after the other. And if you're not careful, you think that this is chronological. But in fact, we're being told one story, and then we're being told, well, how this other story overlaps the previous story. Because what happens in the very next one, we get a little bit more facts. Two separate battles going on probably at nearly the same time. Saul lost his battle and died. David wins his battle and recovers all that was taken away. You can't have any two greater contrast in the men and the results than Saul and David and those two different battles. The difference in these two men and the difference in their reign is going to be on display. You're going to really need to take note and remember what you learned, what you saw with Saul. What kind of characteristics did you see him show during his reign? And now notice what you'll learn about David as he sits on the throne. There is a big difference in their character, and I think that's due to their relationship with God. I wonder if Saul even had one. Then, of course, we're introduced to a character. Now, we don't know the man's name. We know where he was from. We know some other things that he said. But I don't think that this man that you're going to get introduced to in verses 2 through 5 is nothing more than an opportunist. That's strictly my opinion. You need to know that based on what I've read, what I study. I just think it's my opinion. But you watch what he does and think of why he's doing it. And it really does kind of amaze me that I've read some commentators that will say, well, see, he gives us the better story or the truer story of what happened than what we read about in 1 Samuel with the account that was told to us previously. And I'm like, no, I don't think so at all. So let's look at this survivor from Saul, verses 2 through 5. And it came to pass on the third day, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul. I'm going to say he came from that direction, because that's where he came from. But I don't think he was necessarily a man that was in the camp of Saul. Just that he came from the camp of Saul. With his clothes rent and earth upon his head. Already now, what does that make you think of? It makes you think of somebody in mourning, right? But I think that's kind of for show. I think it's for personal protection. He knows where he's going. He knows what he's got in his hand. And you'll see what he's got in his hand a little bit later. And the news, but they're conflicting. Anyway, and so it was when he came to David that he fell to the earth and he did obeisance. It's obvious that this man is in mourning, or at least making it appear that he's so, to go along with this story. If the battle was lost, a lot of times, I do have to say this, if the battle was lost and they knew it was lost, oftentimes they would take a man and send him out while he could still get out to get the information back that we've lost. All hope is gone. And oftentimes that would happen. They would send a man out in that way. So a messenger would be sent. I just don't think that with everything that we've heard before and what we're going to hear, that's this man. Verse 3, and David said unto him, from whence comest thou? Now again, I don't think that this man walked into the city and walked just right up to David. Remember who David is. People are not going to just let him walk up to David. I think that probably he's already been telling his story, and people are directing him to David because David needs to hear this story, at least from what he's saying. And David said unto him, from whence comest thou? And he said unto him, out of the camp of Israel am I escaped. And David said unto him, how went the matter? I pray thee tell me. Now remember, David knows, because he was possibly going to be fighting in this battle, but from the wrong side, or he was going to have some problems there. He said, I pray thee tell me. And he answered that the people are fled from the battle, and many of the people also are fallen and dead, and Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also. Now, we don't read anything in the previous context about people fleeing from the battle. In fact, it made it sound more like if there were any that escaped, it was very, very few that got away with their lives from this, because Saul and Jonathan did not. But this man didn't just blurt out the information. He was asked. He was being interviewed by David, king of Judah. The news of this loss strikes David's heart. The news of Jonathan's death is a hard blow. And so in verse 5, David said unto the young man that told him, he said this, how knowest thou that Saul and Jonathan his son be dead? I want to get the facts, and I want to know that this information is accurate. And that's what he was doing. It's what anybody should do. Well, then that's where I get to me. This is the lying scavenger. That's what I call him. Now, you can make it that he's just the news guy, but I don't think so. I think there's something bad wrong here. From verse 6 to verse 10, David wants more facts, more details, and the young man that told him said, as I happen by chance. Now, wait a minute. Didn't you just say that you came from the camp of Israel, that you escaped? And now you're saying that I just happened by chance upon Mount Gilboa? Remember where they were running to. They were running away from the battle. They were trying to get away, and they were running towards Saul, and he was up in the mountain area where he was perched up and could see everything, but they got a hold of him too. So as I happened by chance upon Mount Gilboa, I think this guy's probably been watching what's going on and everything else. He's, again, I say, an opportunist. He's a lying scavenger. And so he says, behold, Saul leaned upon his spear. That part's correct. And lo, the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him. We don't hear anything about that in the previous book. Nothing is mentioned. In fact, what we do find out is the archers got him. What may have happened after Saul falls upon his spear, after this man, as you'll see in a little bit, goes up and grabs hold of the crown and a bracelet that was there of the king's, he probably heard a bunch of horses coming up after him, and he takes off running. That's likely what happened. The chariots and horsemen, he says, followed hard after him. So I think this guy grabbed what he could and ran. And now he adds to the story, I believe, to impress David. And when he looked behind him, he saw me. This is talking about Saul. And he called unto me. Now, wait a minute. Didn't you just say they were hard-pressed, the chariots and the horsemen were coming? But here you are. You're going to hang around, and the king calls for you. And he answered and said, yep, here I am. And he said unto me, who art thou? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. Now, I don't think that would sound like that was a friendly voice. And I think Saul would do anything that he could not to be killed by an Amalekite, let alone a Philistine, because they're all enemies. So these were the people, too, that David and his men had just destroyed. He's an enemy of Israel. Yet somehow or another he's with Saul, and he goes on. Again he said, Saul said unto me, again, stand I pray thee upon me. Don't you get a weird picture of that? Saul's fallen upon his sword, and yet the guy's saying he wants Saul to have him come over, stand on him, and thrust his sword or the spear through him. Literally stand on him. That's the picture. And slay me, for anguish has come upon me, because my whole life is yet in me. My life whole is in me. That's, again, not what Saul said. He wasn't anguish for what has come upon him. He was worried about what would come upon him after death. And he didn't want any of that to happen. So the Amalekite is really thinking that he's saying, hey, I did the admirable thing. I obeyed the king. I brought you his crown and his bracelet to prove what I'm saying. So verse 10, so I stood upon him and slew him, because I was sure that he could not live after that he was fallen. And I took the crown that was upon his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and have brought them hither unto my Lord. This man, I have no question in my mind that he had heard how Saul hated David and hunted after David. I think this man's motive in telling David what he did was to impress David, to gain favor with this new king and find a great reward. I mean, wouldn't you think, here's a guy who's been chasing you, hunting you, trying to kill you, and look, I took care of him for you. I don't think he understood anything about the relationship that David had with Saul or Jonathan, or the character of David in being a born-again believer. The problem is that while Saul indeed did hate David, that hate did not go both ways. David did not hate Saul. Plain and simple. And we know that his love for Jonathan was great, and even this story tells a little bit more. So then we see the sincere sorrow, verses 11 and 12. As soon as David hears this, David took hold on his clothes, not the young man's clothes, but his own clothes, and rent them. And likewise, all the men that were with him, they did the same thing. And they mourned and wept and fasted until even, or until that evening, for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. So I think the loss of Jonathan and Saul and all of the army of Israel affected David and his men, and they mourned and wept very sincerely at this terrible news. I think this shows a very sincere, broken heart. David didn't rejoice at the news. He mourned, he wept, he fasted. He mourned for God's anointed. A lot of times, you may not like somebody, but if they're a child of God, and they fall, even if they fall to temptation or a trial or fall into something bad, you should never rejoice. You should sorrow that a child of God has gotten that way or that's happened to them. David's honorable character is revealed, I believe, by his heartfelt reaction. He is the leader of his men. He will soon be the leader of his country. And he was leading them to grieve and to do so with true sorrow. But the story goes on. This guy is headed for trouble. Verses 13 and 14. And David said unto the young man that told him, Whence art thou? Now, the young man had already told him he was an Amalekite, but he answered him again, I am the son of a stranger, an Amalekite. So, again, we're not getting much information, but after David's mourning and fasting, again, this young man seems and appears to be brought before him, and he's asked just two basic questions. David's real question is asked in the next verse, verse 14. And David said unto him, How wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand and destroy the Lord's anointed? Now, we already saw David twice had an opportunity to kill Saul, who was trying to kill him, and he was encouraged to do so by all of his men. But he said he would not do it because he would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. He says, that's going to be for the Lord, or the Lord bringing his enemies to do it. I'm not going to do it. And that's the way that it did happen. Again, David had that same opportunity, but he wouldn't do it because he had a fear of the Lord. This man had no fear of God, but he would soon learn to fear God. I don't know if it was in time or not, but he was headed for trouble. And right after that, we see a sentence of death, verses 15 and 16. David called one of the young men and said, Go near and fall upon him. I mean, there's no waiting, there's no hesitancy. As soon as he asked him, Weren't you afraid to fall on the Lord's anointed? Didn't this cause you to fear? Didn't it cause you to draw back that a king would ask you to kill him and you just, oh yeah, I just went over there, stood on him, that's it. David said, Young man, go over, fall upon him. And he did. He smote him, that he died. And David said unto him, now I get the gist again in this picture that after the young man David sent over smote him, that David issued this proclamation and said, Thy blood be upon thy head, for thy mouth hath testified against thee, saying, I have slain the Lord's anointed. Whether he did it or not, he made that claim, and that's why I said he was headed for trouble, and he got a sentence of death. The man had confessed that he took the life of the king, and David issued a direct command that this man be killed for his confession. He had a crown, and he had a bracelet from Saul, and it proved what he was saying, and that was enough. It must have happened fast. We do not hear of this young man trying to get out of it by changing his story. All we hear is David said, and he did it. Kill him, take his life, and that was it, and that was done. Excuse me. Ooh, a little sneeze. I wonder if he tried because of David's reaction, but we don't know of anything. It doesn't sound like he even had that time. So David gave this final proclamation that his own mouth, his own confession, David took him at his word because he had slain Jehovah's anointed, and that was it. Verses 17 and 18 shows us the continual sorrow. And David lamented with this lamentation. So now what we're doing, all of that scene that we just got was set up to show you this lamentation or this song of sorrow. And his lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan, his son. Also, he bade them teach the children of Judah the use of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. So, Two things out of this. Along with the song he is composing, David issues an order demanding weapons training. They needed to update their military and get busy. But it also say that some say, well, this bow idea that was here is the private record of Israel's government, and David is acting as the king, and he's composing this song. He was saying, this is what we need to teach the children of Judah in using this song. Has to do with the bow, the arrows, the archers that killed him. I don't know for a fact, but these are the last verses of David's song, or these are the verses of David's song. The last that you'll read is basically, it's a eulogy for David, or for Saul and for Jonathan. So we look at it from verse 19 through 17. You've got this song of sorrow. Some say this is the first composing or the first composition that he did as king. It's very likely it is, because Saul just died. He's getting the first message, so this is his first song after he becomes king. It's certainly not his first song, because he composed songs back when he was a shepherd out in the hills watching over the sheep. What does he say? The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How the mighty are fallen. The king and his sons were slain in the mountains of Gilboa. But David goes on to say, tell it not in Gath. Remember where he was at? He's in Ziklag. He doesn't want this information to get out. He doesn't want this song to be sung among the Philistines. Publish it not in the streets of Askelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. He doesn't want them to know anything about their sorrow, their lamentation. So that's why I said at the first part, this is a song for Israel to sing privately in their own private community. They're not to be singing it out where anybody else can hear. There are times for you and I to lament privately. Even when somebody has died, it may make a difference. It may not just be them, but it may be that their death will affect something in our relationship with other people. And sometimes they don't need to know that. So just the fact that this song is not for general publication, and the reason for that is because it would be a source of joy to the Philistines. Don't sing it when any Philistine is around. Verse 21, ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew, neither let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty is violently cast away, the shield of Saul, as though he had not been anointed with oil. David is proclaiming and singing about an awful memory that will always be associated with that mountain. It's kind of the same thing when we lose somebody that we love. Usually that date rolls around every year and we remember it quite well. We remember that month. Or we might remember that location. There's something associated when people pass away that it affects us emotionally, and that's what David is noting there. Not that he is cursing the place, but he is noticing, to me, when he's talking about this, he said there's never going to be another pleasant day because of that memory in that particular location. The brave men, the mighty men of Israel, literally a lot of them had to throw away their armor to lighten their load that they could flee from the enemy. The protection for the king was cast aside and treated without honor. They cared, a lot of them ended up caring for their own life more than they did for the king. That's very sad. But you have to think, David, how many men would have given up their lives before they would allow their king to be killed? Every one of them would have. Saul's, not so much. Remember, he had 3,000 men a lot of times that were traveling with him. So David gives Saul much more honor than he deserved. Verse 22. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back. They didn't bail, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. They died in battle. Verse 23, Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, And in their death, they were not divided. They died at the same time. They lived together. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Hyperbole is not uncommon in eulogies. Isn't that true? He's remembering the better days, the stronger days. He's remembering the first days of Saul's reign. And so he honors their relationship as father and son, their fighting and their actions. And indeed, Saul was a great victor in many of the battles he had early on. He remembered the good that they had done, and so now he encourages Israel. Verse 24, ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet, riches, in other words, and with other delights, and who put on ornaments of gold, or put ornaments of gold upon your apparel. He enriched you. He honored them. He was stirred to write this poetry, and then he sings in the last few verses again, how are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. No wonder, since David didn't know how to settle on one woman anyway. He had a problem with loving, or apparently lusting, after too many women. People will take this verse and make it mean something very ugly. This has nothing to do with the contrary views that some people will have about David's love for Jonathan. If you don't understand how that you can love a person that doesn't have anything to do with sex, then you don't know love. Hey. That's got not anything to do with it at all. You can love another person with great regard and admiration, appreciation. I have friends and even my family members that are men that I love. And it doesn't go any, you know what I'm talking about. I don't even want to go there. Anyway, it was not expressed in an unholy manner, but it was certain and expressive of his true love for Jonathan. And remember, too, when it says passing the love of women, he does have 3 wives at this time. 2 of them, at least, are there in Ziklag, and one of them is the daughter of Saul. But again, in verse 27, the final verse, how are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? David spoke in this song of the beauty of Israel, the mighty of Israel, and the might of Israel. He spoke of the lovely, the generous, and of course of Jonathan. David did not speak of his being hunted by Saul. He did not sing of Saul's bewildering obsession with chasing him and wanting to kill him. But he did respect, to me, the throne a great deal, and he respected the man who sat upon the throne as God's anointed. You know how many times I've heard, well, you respect the office, you don't have to respect the man. David respected both the office and the man, even though he was fallen, even though he was not what he should have been. This is the story of David becoming king. No longer, really now, is David in exile. He immediately acts with his kingdom in mind. Even in composing this song, he did so as the king. You have to think about it. The test of our character and the recognition of God's grace in our lives is often evaluated by how we respond when one or when many who hate us or who are against us or are holding us back from our rightful place, how they die or displaced. How do we respond when they fall on hard times? How do we respond when they die? How do we respond when they are disgraced? Are we gracious? We ought to be, just like David. The hand of God fell upon them. Should we not grieve and sorrow and not rejoice, just like David did? I think it's a good lesson that the man who becomes king is not rejoicing when one of his enemies dies. He sorrows over one who was God's anointed. I pray that's been a blessing to you. Just getting into starting with our new book, starting with, again, 2 Samuel. And I hope this will be a blessing to you as we begin our study here. Don't want to forget, too, about if you're interested,